We are going to talk about something exciting, something new, something very recent. My name is Giuseppe Maxiam. I'm known as the data charmer. I currently work as a QA architect at VMware, and before I've worked for a long time in databases, in the open source community, especially with MySQL. I have a Twitter account, Data Charmer, and in there you will find the slides eventually, meaning later after this talk. So what is it that we are going to talk today? The roles are a feature available since MySQL 8.0.0. Now we have 8.0.1. And it's something that you create like a user, you grant like a privilege, and then you need to activate. Just to give you an idea, let's start with a bad example. So what you see on the screen, I create a role named powerful. Then I grant everything to this role, so it's really powerful. Then I create a user called do it all. And then I grant this powerful to the user. So far, so good. What happens now? I connect with the user do it all, and I try to access a database, and I get access denied. Then I do a show grants, and I see that grant powerful is there. But is apparently not doing what I want. So what happens here, we are going to explain this in the next slide. So stay with me, don't leave. At the end, you'll know the answer. Okay, let's start from the beginning. How do you use roles? The first step is to create a role. It's a new command. It's called create role. You just create a role just like a user. Then you grant privileges to this role, and then you have an entity that contains these new privileges. You create a user. Okay, we know about that. We grant the role to the user. Instead of granting privileges, we grant a role. And the last thing, we set the role either temporarily or as a default. Let's see step by step. Create a role. You see, very simple. Create a role, name of the role. Grant privileges to role, exactly as you do to a user. Create user, you know that. We have already used that in the past. Then you grant role to the user. Here there is something different. When you grant a role, when you grant a role, there is no on clause. So you don't say grant role on, you just grant the role as it is. Is it going around on its own? The last step is set the role. You have to set the role, otherwise it will not work, like we have seen in the bad example before. This is going on its own. I'm going to remove it. So you can use alter user, or you can use set default role. Both of them will achieve the same result. A few points that are important to remember when you deal with roles. You can grant more than one role. So if you have several roles that do half of what you want the user to do, you can grant both of them to the user, and then the user will have the sum of the privileges. In the same way, you can set the default role, not as a single role, but a list of roles. A surprise for me when I started using roles, it was that the roles end up in the user table. So what is a role? Basically, it's a user without a login. As we have seen in the example, once you have granted the role, your job is not finished. You or the user need to activate the role. Otherwise, the role is just an attribute to the user, but it's not something that the user can use at the moment. So either you set the role by default, or the user will set the role temporarily when it works. Since the role is a user, you can grant a user to a user. So you don't need to create a role. You have a user that has already the privileges. You just grant that role, that user, to some other user. So the user will inherit everything that belongs to the other user. And if you think about that, this is logical because roles are users without logins. You may get confused when you want to set role. So there is a set role command that the user will use to set the role temporarily, so decides, I want to use this role. Set default role, instead, will set the role forever, so it will be permanently. Instead, set role default means among all the roles that I have, take the default one as the current role. So this is it's a temporary assignment. I know, it's confusing, but you will get used to it. If you want to tell roles from users, well, you need to be organized. There are no statements that tell you the list of roles. You just get the users. So you need to organize yourself in such a way that you distinguish the roles with the name. For example, we start with R_, so you know these are roles. Maybe the MySQL team will do something better in the future, but this is what it's available today. There are a few new tables in the MySQL schema dedicated to roles. Very important tables. Role edges will tell which roles are assigned to users. Notice that you will not find roles that were created but not assigned. And default roles will have the list of roles that have been used as default. Let's see some examples so we know better what we are dealing with. I want to create several roles. So in an organization, I don't have a single role, of course. I have many of them. I will have a observer role. This observer will only have the select privilege. Note that everything here belongs to the database LOTR, which stands for, come on, Lord of the Rings. So we have a database Lord of the Rings, and we have a role observer that will only do select. Then we have a role tester that can select, insert, update, and delete in this database. Then we have all privileges on this database for developers, and all privileges everywhere to the DBA. So I have 4 roles with specific privileges, Then I create a bunch of users. I have Bilbo, Frodo, Sam, Pippin, Merry, Boromir, Gimli, Aragorn, Legolas, Gandalf, Galadriel, and Gollum. I always wanted to say that during the presentation. So we have observers that are Pippin, Merry, Boromir, and Gollum. So these guys can only do select. And then I say set default role observer to this user. It means that when this user connect, they will always immediately be able to do what I decided that this role is designed for. Similarly, I assign the role tester to Sam, Bilbo, and Gimli, and the role developer to Frodo, Aragorn, and Legolas, and the role DBA to Gandalf and Galadriel. So you see there is a big family there and a lot of roles. So let's try to put ourselves in the administrator point of view and see what we can do with this sort of complex situation. So the first thing that we can see the list of users. Here you have host user authentication string from the user table in the MySQL database. You can see immediately that users have a password authentication string and roles don't. It doesn't mean much because you can create a role with password and create a role user without password. But you know, visually, if you are using the default authentication with password, this will tell you something. What you can see also is that since I have used a convention for the role names, the ones that start with R underscore are roles. Good so far? Everybody's following? Okay. So we can find the roles empirically. We can say select a host user from MySQL user where password is expired and the account is locked, which is the default for roles. I mean, you can have also users in this situation, but if you are starting a new system, this is likely, this will likely find you the roles. Or you can use the naming convention, so you say select host user from user where user like R underscore and %. And this will find the roles. But again, I said this depends on how well organized you are as an admin. Let's have a look at the new table. We have a role age table, and it tells me which roles were assigned. So remember, you will not find here the roles that were created but not given to any user. It's useful this way, but you will see that we can see this table in a different way. Also, we have the default roles. So you see there is the combination from which user to which role. So from which user has which role as a default. But let's try to use these tables in a more proficient way. For example, I can query the table to see which users are DBAs. So I just say select two users from role ages, where from user equals the DBA. And this gives me the list of DBAs. Or the list of developers. You see, if we give some meaning to the table, we can get some information that is useful for our organization. Or we can create a summary of everything. So we can say the list of select a role how many we have, and then group concat the users, so we know for each role how many users were assigned, count, and then the list of the users that belong to that role. You see, it's a relatively simple query that will give you meaningful information about the roles in general. We can do the same thing for the default roles. So from the default roles table, we can get the default role, group concat, and then we know that, for example, the DBA role is the default for Galadriel and Gandalf. Let's go to the other side and let's try from the point of view of the user that has been assigned a role. Let's see the user Bilbo when the role, the default role exists. We do a show grants. You know, you can do show grants for your own grants. And what do we get? We get the grants for Bilbo, that is usage. And then we get the grants that come from the role, select, insert, update, delete, and we get the explicit privileges because there is a default role. If we run a query select current role, we see that there is a role LOTR tester. So this is the desirable situation where the user has a default role, and the show grants will show you not only which role was assigned, but also the grants that belong to that role. Let's see instead if the user does not have a default role. In this case, we do a show grants, and we see grant usage, okay, and then grant LOTR tester. It means that the role exists, but we don't know what is the content of that role. So we need to try another query, show grants for Bilbo, using LOTR tester. So we put the name of the role explicitly in the query, and then we'll see what grants we will get if we enable that role, meaning that we need to run set role, otherwise the user will not be able to see or to use that role at all. So what happens when we try? We say use LOTR, that is one of the privileges that should be available for the LOTR tester. So, and we get access denied, like we saw in our first example. What do? We do set role LOTR tester, and then use the database, and the role is accepted. So it means that the role is activated. We have to remember that the set role is not permanent. So if we do a connect, meaning that we change the session, the role that was set with set role disappears, and then we get again an error. However, if the role was assigned with the set default role, then it is permanent and it can be used after a reconnection. So let's go back to the bad example. Remember, we have user that was assigned the powerful role, and we tried use test, and we got access denied. Show grants, we saw that a powerful exists, but we couldn't use it. So what happens in this case? We have to say set role powerful or do a set default role. When we do set role powerful and show grants, you see that the roles that belong to powerful are all explicit in the show grants. So you see that now this guy is really powerful. And when you do a use test, the database change happens without errors. All right, so you can find this presentation at bit.ly/roles_80. And then I will put that on Twitter so you can find again. I have time for questions, 4 minutes.
So, yeah, you have to change the role from if you get multiple roles, you have to change the roles to get more or less powerful roles.
So if I have multiple roles, I can do one of two things. I can set the default role for both of them, or I can set a default role for only one of them, or I can set one of the roles explicitly for one or more of them. I have multiple possibilities. Remember this, if you have multiple roles set as default, you can always change your default role by doing a set role. So you say you have 2 roles already assigned to you as default, meaning that they are active, and then you start working and say, okay, I don't want to use this role, so I say I use role another, maybe a less powerful user to avoid costing mistakes. And if you do the set role, no matter what happened during the default roles, you will use the role that you have decided to use with set role.
Can we assign a role to role?
Can we assign a role to role? Yes, we can. We can assign a role to role, a user to user, a user to role. And a role to user, of course. It is done on purpose. So if you have several roles and you want to create a role that is the combination of these 2 roles, you just assign these 2 roles to the third role. More questions? Okay, I am going to ask a question then. Who is going to use these roles as soon as this becomes GA? Do you think this implementation is good? Yes?
Some more stuff.
Okay, thank you. One.
I haven't actually implemented roles for MariaDB.
Say that again?
I have implemented roles for MariaDB in 2013.
Okay.
Compare the different implementations between what MySQL provides now and what MariaDB provides.
I have not compared the implementation. I just looked at the documentation and I saw that there is a flag to distinguish the roles between from users, and this should be useful.
Yeah, that wasn't bad. I wanted to point out that MariaDB has an easy way to distinguish between role and user.
Yeah.
And I think it would be something useful that MySQL could also have.
Yeah, there is a bug report for that, and the MySQL team is looking into it. Thank you very much.